Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 29 of my organisational series. In this video I'll compare the strengths of the WARPAC, or Warsaw Pact, and NATO formations, specifically around about 1989. For this video I'm determining the strengths of the WARPAC and NATO formations based on a points system from a micro-armor set of rules, specifically the rules Corps Commander. It's difficult to know how accurate this is, but at least there is some deterministic science in the methodology these rules use. There is one caveat, which is quality, training and morale. The points system only looks at the technical combat values of formation, such as its ability to project firepower and defend against enemy firepower. No attempt has been made to qualify factors such as quality, training, morale, or even doctrine. If I attempted this, the combat values would be basically my personal gut feeling, which could easily differ from the gut feeling of someone else. Viewers will need to make their own estimates of these intangible factors and how they may affect combat strengths. But as a general rule of thumb, the Soviet forces should probably get some discount for this. That is, their combat value should be reduced and NATO should be increased slightly. But by how much, I have no idea. This segues into something that's rather important to understand about quality, training, morale and doctrine, which is even professional soldiers are uncertain about the impact of these factors. If you assume your guys are better trained, have high morale and training, and you have superior doctrine, you may actually be proven wrong when you actually get into combat. Assuming the other guy does not catch up with you or could never exceed your ability can prove rather dangerous on the battlefield. However, saying all that, as I indicated earlier, I personally feel NATO did have an advantage in terms of doctrine, training, quality and long-term morale over the Soviets. But unless I have some actual conflicts to study, I can never really be certain of this or how much this really mattered. As a result of this, many viewers with a knowledge of the period may be surprised at how powerful many Soviet formations are in this video. Remember, the values are not modified by these intangibles that I've just spoken about. If viewers have played any Cold War board games, they would have noticed the NATO battalions are often as powerful as Soviet regiments. This is because the game designers have factored in quality, or at least they've attempted to. The other caveat is I've averaged out a lot of the WARPAC formations. I've used the concept of the first, second and third wave divisions. I'm reasonably certain the Soviets never organised their divisions in this manner. Instead, they classed all divisions as ready, not ready and reserve, with a final militia classification. As for equipment, the divisions in East Germany received most of the newer equipment, but divisions were upgraded across the entire WARPAC country range using a methodology I'm not familiar with. Not ready divisions in Russia could contain more modern equipment than ready divisions in Poland, for example. One day I'll need to list all the divisions by equipment type based on the equipment inventory available from sources from former East Germany. Once I do this, I will have a better view of what a first wave, second wave or third wave division was and were they deployed or where they were deployed. However, for this video I'll use a more normalized or simplistic view. So with those caveats, let's move on with the video. The original points values for most of the formations are normally provided in the thousands, which make it harder to see the differences in combat capability. To make it easier, all values are divided by 100 and rounded to the closest value. This makes it easier to see if a battalion is strong or weak, although this rounding may reduce the accuracy of the analysis to an extent. Let's start by comparing NATO formations with each other. I'll be comparing brigades or regiment-sized formations and shall only be looking at the core regiments of a division, such as a tank or infantry regiment or brigade. As a result, support and artillery formations will be overlooked. This does give the Soviets a bit more of an advantage, as NATO divisions did contain a significant amount of combat capacity, which in their support organisations, which would have been farmed out to their subordinate regiments in real life. So just take this into account. We'll start with the Armoured Brigade in the Road Armoured Division, US of course. There were two types of armoured brigades in this division, this being the smallest one. The larger brigade contained an additional infantry battalion. The mechanised brigades contained one less armoured battalion and one more mech battalion. The most powerful brigade in the US Army was the Type 86 Armoured Brigade.
The structure of this brigade could vary, but this would be a default structure. As you can see, this was significantly more powerful than the road structure, and while the M1 main battle tank was significantly better than the M60, other battalion-related factors meant the strength was only slightly greater. The big difference was the mech infantry battalions, which were very powerful. Of course, they would be more effective in defence, and the armoured battalions would always be the primary attack formations. Let's now look at the British. In this case, an older Type 82 armoured brigade. You can see that it was comparable with the US road brigades. Now we can see the brigade contained the new MBTs and ICVs, and the impact of these new weapon systems was significant, although still not as powerful as the US brigade. The tank battalion were, on the other hand, more powerful than the US equivalent. We now have a British mechanised brigade, which is a surprisingly powerful and large formation. The final formation for the British was the infantry brigade, which is significantly weaker but nonetheless effective in defence. I've also included the Canadian brigade, which is not as powerful, although in reality its quality level would have been significantly high, or very high. We'll now look at a West German Panzer brigade, which was surprisingly weak compared with the US and UK equivalents. The Panzer Grenadier brigade was weaker again. For comparison, I'm also including the 50S infantry brigades, which would have been merged in with the 70 and 80S infantry brigades to form infantry or motorised infantry divisions in the case of war. These formations used older equipment. This is still respectful in terms of strength and would have been useful in defence, even though it used older equipment and was not as well armoured as the regular army. The 60S mechanised brigade is slightly weaker than the 50S infantry brigade or mechanised brigade. Finally, we have the 80S brigade, which is effectively men in trucks, and as a result, its strength reflects that. When we move over to the Belgium formations, the Belgium mechanised brigade is also rather weak. On the other hand, the Belgium armoured brigade is very powerful indeed. Let's move over to Denmark, and this shows their mechanised brigade, which has reasonable punch. This is surprising considering the poor press this nation normally gets, or used to get back in the day. When we move to the Netherlands, we see the Dutch armoured brigade is up with the most powerful brigades in NATO. Even the Dutch mechanised brigade is very powerful and would have been highly effective. The French do not have brigades and instead have large divisions which consist of battalion-sized regiments. The result is a very powerful formation if we compare it with a brigade, but a rather weak formation if we compare it with a full division. The French mechanised division, also structured in the manner of a large brigade, is also very powerful. However, the other NATO divisions have 2 to 3 brigades each, which do need to be considered, so most other NATO divisions were significantly more powerful than a French division. This shows all the armoured brigade from the major NATO nations. Putting the French division to one side due to their unusual structure, the most powerful formation here is the Type 86 US Armoured Brigade, followed by the UK Armoured Brigade using their latest equipment. When we move over to the mechanised brigade, the most powerful formation is the British mechanised brigade, followed by the Dutch mechanised brigade. Let's now look at the WARPAC formations to see how they compare with the NATO formations. When we first look at what NATO would call a first wave tank division, the one at the top is equipped with T-80s and the one at the bottom with T-72s. That's the 2 lines at the top of this slide. These are comparable with NATO brigades, although compared with the US and UK brigades are weaker. Based on this point system, the difference between the T-80 and T-72 was not earth-shattering, although the tank battalions in the tank regiment seem to be appreciably more powerful. When we move over to what NATO would call a second wave tank division, which were equipped with T-64 main battle tanks, or T-62 in some cases, we see a slight reduction in strength, but again, not really earth-shattering. When we look at what NATO calls third wave tank divisions equipped with T-55s and older equipment, or other older equipment, this shows a much more significant drop in combat strength. The largest difference between these division types would come down to quality and training. So in reality, I would expect an even more dramatic drop in combat strength for a true third wave division if this kind of structure actually existed in the Russian army or the Soviet army. In reality, I would suggest a ready division would probably have high levels of training and readiness, non-ready lower, and of course militia the worst again. Let's move over to the motor rifle divisions. This shows a first wave motor rifle division equipped with T-80 main battle tanks, and the mech regiment, as you can see here, is reasonably formidable as it's also equipped with the latest MICVs, or infantry combat vehicles. When we look at a first wave motor rifle division equipped with T-72s, this shows a reasonable significant downward trend in terms of combat strength. The second wave motor rifle divisions equipped with T-64s and the equivalent APC's infantry combat vehicles show a significant drop in combat strength, less related to the main battle tank and more to do with the supporting formations at regimental level. Finally, for the Russians at least, the third wave motor rifle divisions experience a drop, but not that significant compared with a second wave. Once again, I feel the largest downside to these third wave or reserve divisions would have been their lack of quality and training. Let's now compare WARPAC with NATO. First, I'll compare NATO brigades with regiments from the Soviet tank divisions. As expected, the NATO panzer brigades are generally more powerful than the tank regiments in a tank division for the Soviets. However, it must be noted the Soviets had a lot more tank regiments than NATO had tank brigades. When we move to the mechanised infantry brigades and regiments, we see the same trend when compared with the British, but not so much with other nations. It should be noted the Soviet mechanised infantry regiments all come from the tank divisions. We'll now look at what occurs when we compare NATO brigades with the regiments from the Soviet motor rifle divisions. The story is much the same as with the tank regiments and brigades, if not worse actually for the Soviets. Should be noted the Soviets tended to deploy older main battle tanks in their motor rifle divisions, at least in theory, with many being equipped with T-64 main battle tanks. However, I must admit, when I start looking at the actual inventory, the story is nowhere near as clear as that. The equipment mixes seem to be all over the place in some ways. I'm going to have to drill down into the entire equipment inventory for all the divisions to get a better view of exactly how the Soviets deployed their equipment or their newer equipment and how they replaced their older equipment. Now let's look at the BTR regiments from the motor rifle divisions. The BMP regiments do not differ very much, so we'll skip that comparison. While the BTR regiments in a what NATO would call first wave division was respectful, those from the other waves would most likely be focused on defence and were significantly weaker as a result, primarily due to lack of equipment and also a lot of supporting formations within the regiments. What are my conclusions? In simple terms, when we simply look at the equipment, NATO would have been severely outnumbered by the Soviets. Their only hope would have been quality, which I cannot assess except subjectively. To help us try and work out this quality issue, let's look at an SPI board game called BAOR, which was published in 1981. This shows the values of a Soviet tank regiment and mechanised regiment in a tank division, compared with battalions from a West German and British armoured division. The first thing to notice is NATO forces are shown as battalions rather than regiments, which is a doctrine effect. The Soviets would have most likely operated as regiments, while NATO would have operated as battalions. In terms of strength, the Soviet equipment has an attack strength of 11 compared with a probably West German regiment attack strength of 14, which does not align with my points-based strengths, but is kind of close enough. In defence, the Soviet regiment has a defence strength of 12 compared with the West German regiment defence strength of 20, which again does not align with my points-based system at all. So quality and training must be rearing its head here in this particular case. If we look at the British regiment, which has an attack strength of 15, the values don't align with my points-based system at all. In defence, the British have a strength of 19 compared with 12 for a Soviet tank regiment, What I find unusual is the British versus West German values also don't align with my point system, so I'm uncertain how these values were actually originally derived. In conclusion, I feel that this board game gives NATO some form of morale, training or quality boost of between 50% to 100%, which may be correct, although at 100% seems rather large, but I really have no way of verifying this. One difference I can verify is doctrine. The Soviets would have operated at regimental level rather than allowing battalions to operate independently. The difference here is doctrine and command and control, although how this impacts combat or the effects of combat is also rather difficult to ascertain. And so this concludes episode 29 of my organisational video series, in this case comparing WARPAC and NATO military formations in the 1980s. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.